The question in Washington these days is not just where is the Mueller investigation into President Donald Trump going, but who is next? After seeing both his lawyer, Michael Cohen, and a central figure in his business empire, Alan Weisselberg, agree to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for immunity, Trump then learned that David Pecker, a longtime friend and a key media player, had done the same. Pecker is the chairman of American Media Inc., AMI, which owns the National Enquirer, a supermarket tabloid not known for stellar journalism. The Enquirer is part of the Trump story, not just because of the stories it published, but because of the ones it didn't. The practice is known as catch and kill. It works like this. If someone had a potentially damaging story about Donald Trump for sale, the Enquirer would buy it and bury it so that that bad news would never see the light of day. What about the legal precedent, though? A newspaper under investigation. To that, prosecutors argue the Enquirer is no news outlet, it's a political tool. Our starting point this week is New York City. They're dropping like flies, flipping like pancakes. One by one, some of Donald Trump's closest confidants have become witnesses for the possible prosecution of the president.
Those people are Michael Cohen, who was Trump's longtime personal attorney and his longtime fixer. And you also now have Alan Weisselberg, who was the CFO of the Trump organization and was sort of the guy who took care of Trump's money. And David Pecker, who headed the group that owned the National Enquirer and kept a lot of Trump secrets. So you have the guy who got rid of his legal troubles, the guy who got rid of his money problems, and the guy who got rid of his scandals, now all cooperating in these investigations.
And the notion now that David Pecker might flip on Donald Trump is a surreal, huge development. I don't think you can overstate it, because the fact of the matter is, I think these two guys know a lot about each other. And if one of them starts talking about the other one, in this case, the publisher talking about the president, there's no end where that will go, but it cannot be good for Donald Trump.
The publication that David Pecker controls, the National Enquirer, holds a unique, seedy place in the American media landscape. Founded in 1926, it's a supermarket tabloid, and it goes where other papers do not, openly paying sources for stories of the most sensational kind. During the 2016 presidential election campaign, the Enquirer's support for Donald Trump was flagrant. It lauded the candidate, went after his Republican rivals with dubious allegations, and then did the same with Hillary Clinton. The Enquirer's journalism was not worthy of having an effect on the election's outcome. However, given its visibility, it may well have.
The National Enquirer is a trashy tabloid. It's not even political, right? Most of its coverage is about celebrity scandals, half of which are not true. However, it does have a prominent place in U.S. culture, both for the kind of just pleasure of reading the salacious gossip that it propounds, and also because physically, in all supermarkets across the nation, the National Enquirer is found right at the checkout line.
The cover of the National Enquirer is seen by millions and millions of people who are low information voters who don't even need to buy the magazine, and they read the headline and they think, at least a lot of them do, that it's at least credible, if not totally real. That's something you literally cannot purchase. It was very obvious that the National Enquirer, through Donald Trump's friendship with David Pecker, was an arm of the Trump campaign. In fact, they were doing things that a campaign would never dream of trying to get away with.
The National Enquirer is also where stories go to die, when those stories are potentially damaging to Donald Trump. In August of 2016, just months before the election, the Enquirer paid a former Playboy model, Karen McDougal, $150,000 for her story of an affair with Trump. The agreement stipulated that McDougal could not tell her story to anyone else, but the Enquirer never published it. It caught the story, then effectively killed it. And the paper did the same with a story alleging Trump had fathered a child out of wedlock in the late 1980s. And those are just the catch and kill stories involving Trump and the Enquirer that we know about. No one would be shocked if there were others.
what David Pecker does is he buys the rights to those stories, but then he never publishes those stories. Those stories never see the light of day. He keeps them in a safe, but in return, David Pecker gets other things from Trump, other stories, other bits of gossip, and he trades on that with Donald Trump.
If you go out and pay a substantial amount of money for a story, and then you put that story aside, you kill it during the course of a campaign, you are effectively making a campaign contribution. If we've got a circumstance where information that would be of interest to the great mass of people is being pulled out of the process and hidden on behalf of a particular candidate, it's hard not to see that as beneficial to the candidate.
So they are both responsible for burnishing his reputation as well as for making sure that negative coverage of him did not come to light. So the fact that Pecker is now working for the investigation means that all of the knowledge of those stories, and we only know a couple, but it's likely that there's more, are now going to become known by the investigators into Trump and into potential collusion.
How worried is Donald Trump about what kind of stories the Enquirer has under lock and key? According to the New York Times, very. It reported this past week that Trump tried to buy those stories from AMI just prior to the 2016 election, but that an agreement between him and David Pecker was never reached. And Trump isn't the only American concerned by the fact that the Enquirer is under investigation and the potential legal precedent this case could set. Newspapers, even ones like the Enquirer, are constitutionally protected under the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of the press.
I believe in a very broad interpretation of the First Amendment, and that even a gossip publication, they have a full right to invoke those protections because it is often on the margins that stories that need to be told are first told. And so I think we still have to be very conscious of the right of editors and publishers, writers, to assert freedom of the press protections.
Well, this might not be a newsflash to everybody, but the National Enquirer doesn't do journalism. You know, there's a big difference between being biased in someone's behalf and doing their dirty work, working with their fixer, Michael Cohen, to shut people up who might have negative stories about Donald Trump. The claim here is that the National Enquirer was effectively making a campaign contribution to Donald Trump, and that would be a violation of our campaign finance laws.
Donald Trump first rose to prominence decades ago in New York. For that, he had the city's tabloids to thank. His brash persona suited the Daily News and the New York Post far better than the New York Times. They could not get enough of him. These days, the Times is among the outlets Trump targets.
They are the fake, disgusting news.
And labels the enemy of the American people. Now, as the prosecutors appear to be closing in, the biggest threat posed to the president comes not from the Times, CNN, or the Washington Post. It comes from a tabloid and all the news that the National Enquirer did not consider fit to print.